Hello, Mom.
Hi, Bill.
Are you having a good Thanksgiving?
Oh, great. This is one of the greatest, and it's gone too fast.
And we are on, this is November 29th, 1999, and well, just tell us about the trip so far. When did you arrive?
I arrived a week ago on a Monday, and I'm leaving on the following Tuesday.
Good.
Week.
Good.
And we had a wonderful Thanksgiving. All your friends were here, and Chad and his girlfriend, and we had a feast, real feast.
Good.
And so I spent 2 afternoons and evenings with Scott, Chad, and the 2 great grandchildren, which was delightful.
Griffin
and Sienna,
Good.
whom I hadn't seen. Sienna, niece, Wigard, 3 months, both darling children. Keep on going. So anyway, and then Bill and Susan come up and we had dinner with them. We had just such a good visit with them. And they're in their new house in Petaluma, and Kristen has done such a great job decorating. Looks great.
Okay, well, I had the idea of getting some of your thoughts and recollections of what it was like growing up as a kid in southeastern Ohio and in a big family, and thought that we should record your thoughts and recollections for posterity, for great-grandparents, great-grandkids that are yet unborn and their kids.
Right.
Well, tell me, what was your first recollection as a kid? What was your first recollection that you can remember growing up?
I can remember when my sister Anna Lee was born in May, and she was 3 years old. I can remember that. I was 3 years old. No, yes, I was. I'm 3 years older than she is. And I recollect that very much. And, well, there's too much to pull out.
Well, just tell us about that. Where was she actually born?
In the house, same place I was born, where my father was born. And my grandfather built this house. It was a huge house. I mean, it had 2 rooms in it, a bedroom and living room, and it had a 20 by 24 rug, and we still had 6 feet around it. So you can tell how big they were. But well, it's interesting. My father was on the school board, and he hired my mother to teach out at Whitney School, this one-room school that all of us went to. And then he got her a room just down the hill below the school with his sister, and they got married. He was 31 and she was 25, and they had 10 children. I was number 7. 5 girls and 5 boys.
And Anna Lee was number 8?
8.
Well, where was she actually born? I mean, in the bedroom?
In the great big room.
And who assisted?
My grandfather was a doctor. He was a doctor for her.
And what was his name?
Dr. George Buchanan Hensley.
Okay. Now maybe explain a little bit about the Hensleys and the Fultons.
Well, my mother's name was Hensley, and her father was a doctor in Blair when she came out to this little Whitney. She came out on the train, the Baltimore, Ohio Railroad, and moved it into the farm.
Now, how many brothers and sisters did she have?
Just a brother and sister.
Okay.
And my father had a whole bunch of brothers and sisters.
Okay. And who started the farm to begin with?
My grandfather, my great grandfather started it, and he got the money from coming out to California to the gold rush.
What was his name?
His name was William Fulton. And he went down by boat, Panama Isthmus, Panama, walked across the isthmus, took another boat up to San Francisco, went to Sacramento, on to Virginia City, where he went digging for gold. Don't think he got a lot. He had a very small bag this big, and he had a few nuggets, I think. And then he came home back to across the country overland. So that was quite a venture for a young man.
Was he your grandfather or great-grandfather?
My great-grandfather.
Now, who was your grandfather?
Oh, that was my grandfather, yes. Right, yes, because my great-grandfather had come over from Ireland in 1816.
Okay.
Yeah.
So your father was the son of William.
His name was James Moffat Fulton, and my mom's name was Martha, but she was called Maddie and Nora Hensley Fulton.
What is Moffat? Is that a family
That's
name?
a family name. And all my brothers have family names. My oldest brother, Hensley, and the next one was Thomas, the next one was Parker, and the next one was Wright, and the next was Kirkard, which was my grandmother's maiden name.
Okay. Well, why don't you just kind of go through from the oldest to the youngest and describe each of your brothers and sisters. Just a little description of each one.
Well, my oldest brother graduated from Carnegie Mellon, and he went in the service in World War I.
Your Uncle James?
Uncle James. And he came out of the service, but he went back in the Army, and he retired as a colonel. But he was in Europe for 3.5 years, so through the Signal Corps, setting up communications, and they'd go in ahead. And he was through all of it. He was decorated by de Gaulle with the Croix de Guerre, with palms. So he had quite a lot of experiences.
Was he on Eisenhower's staff?
Yes, he was. He was in Eisenhower's staff in NATO. And he also went in ahead of when Churchill and Stalin and Truman met at Potsdam. And he went in to set up the communications. And he's told us a lot of experiences about that. It's very interesting.
And who was the next oldest?
Janet was the next one, and she married Ross Kilgore. Have 2 sons. And actually, her husband was quite famous in his field as an engineer with patents and all that. She's 90 now. Her husband's 92. So
Yeah, in fact,
they live in near Baltimore area.
Yeah, I can say that I am aware, since I'm a member of the Electronic Historical Museum in Baltimore, that he was just awarded for his very early work in microtube development.
Now the next one is George, and in 1940 he was killed in a coal mine explosion, along with 76 people were, and he had a daughter.
Now, how old were you?
I was a senior in college. I was home for spring vacation when it happened, and we finally recovered the body, and my mother went up to identify it. So that was the first big shock to the family. Okay. And the next one was Mary. She graduated from Muskingum College, was a teacher, and she married Aylesworth Briner, who was agriculture. He had a master's degree in something. He went to Ohio State and then University of Tennessee. It's on the agriculture end of it. And they had 2 children. And lived in northeastern Ohio. And my
No, you're okay. Just
Yeah.
to keep the reflection
Okay.
off your glasses, if you look at me
Okay.
here.
My brother Albert, also Ohio State graduate, he stayed in the farm area of where I grew up. He was a teacher, and he worked on the farm also. He had four children. I might add, we had 24 cousins, next generation, out of the 10 children.
So I was one of those 24.
Yes, you were the one.
From Janet and Denny.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I was the next one. No, Martha, my sister Martha. And she lives in York, Pennsylvania, with 3 children. And she married Ohio State. They were both Ohio State people. And he was in the agricultural field, and he managed these extensive farms for a well-to-do family in York. And she still lives there.
Didn't he have a radio program too?
Yeah, he had a radio program.
What was the program about?
On farm things. He was at about 5:30 in the morning, and I know when he would. One time he went back after visiting our family, and he was talking about so many people visiting our house. Every time he went, he was slept in a different bed. There were 32 people there, and he was described it one morning, 5:30 in the morning.
He was a character.
Yeah, he was a character. And I was 7th, and I graduated from Ohio State University, and my husband, Bill Wickard, was an engineering student from there, and primarily worked for Westinghouse the whole time of his life. And we had 2 children, my son Bill Wickard, who is in charge of this operation.
You actually had 3.
How many did I say?
2.
2, I have 3, yeah. I'm nervous. And a daughter, Janet Rowe, who lives in South Carolina, and I have now moved to be close to her. Well, first Bill had 2 sons, great sons, Scott and Chad. And Scott has a great family, as I mentioned. And I live near my daughter down in South Carolina now, where my husband and I actually were during the war. In fact, my son Bill was born in South Carolina, Somerville. So he was born a Southerner. And I have a younger son, Denny, who lives out in near Denver, Evergreen, and he has 2 delightful daughters.
Well, I want you to name the rest of your younger brothers and sisters, but first, how about just a diversion? How did you meet Dad? How did you meet?
Oh, one time my roommate and I were studying. It was in the spring, and
Where is this?
At Ohio State University, and we went down to get a Coke or milkshake at the Hennick's of Ohio State's famous hangout. Everybody went there, knew it. And I was sitting there, and my roommate and some fellow that I knew came over. And he wanted to meet my roommate, and he sat down, and my husband came over. Bill, my future husband, came over, and he said to Al, the other fella, I want an introduction. So we introduced, and he introduced us, and he sat down with us. I remember they wouldn't let us out to go home, and we had to be in at 10:30, and I remember crawling down under the table and out the aisle to get back at 10:30. That's the first time I met him. Should have been a real warning. And we had, well, first date, we went out to Dublin nightclub. Columbus isn't there now. It's out on the other side of the Ohio State Stadium. We doubled with this couple. And then the next time we went to Buckeye Lake, danced. I don't remember who the orchestra was. And he walked home with Al, the guy that introduced us, and says, I'm going to marry that girl sometime. So the next day, Al come over to see me, and he warned me against him. He said, you don't want to do it. Well, I waited 2 years, and I did marry him.
So when did you actually, what was the year you met?
We met in end of my junior year, and to be 39. And we both had dates to come back, but we never kept the dates, and we just dated from then on. And then I was through 2 quarters before he was, so I taught Chillicothe, which is about 50 miles from there. And then we were married June 22nd, 1941, and lived in Sharon, Pennsylvania. And he went with Westinghouse then, with the transformer division. And we were only there until April. Well, Pearl Harbor happened. And as it turned out, he went to work for the Naval Bureau of Ordnance, and working against the protection of ships against magnetic mines. And we were sent to Charleston, South Carolina, and we lived in Somerville, South Carolina. That's where my son Bill was born.
And he'd go out actually on the ships?
Oh, yeah. when they'd go out, after they protected the ships, they had to just put all these coils around and everything. They had to take the ships out to adjust compasses because they were all out of whack because of the magnetism. And after they got out to sea, the captain would just turn the ships over to them.
So they, so they degaused the ship so that they
Yeah.
wouldn't trigger the mines, but
That's
in
right.
so doing, that
Made them.
made them screwed up the compasses.
One time he almost went to China because this boat was going to China. They wouldn't let him off. And he did get off finally.
We'll come back to Dad some more. Let's finish describing now your next sibling in order.
The next one after me was Charlie. He was 18 months younger than me. And he went to St. Clairesville High School. And he stayed on the farm. Later he went into construction, but after the war. But he was a Marine during the war. And he was sent to South Pacific and was shot on Iwo Jima, and he says it's the best thing ever happened because they put him on the hospital ship. He still has some shrapnel in his arm, still in there, but it was a horrible experience for him. From what little he's talked about it.
I remember when Uncle Charlie came up to Cleveland to watch the Cleveland Indians play the New York Giants in the 1954 World Series, and they had tickets to the 5th game.
Charlie and William.
Charlie and William, and they were going to go with Dad to the game. And of course, the Indians were favored in that game, in that series, but the Giants swept them in 4 games, so they didn't get to go see the game.
They didn't get to see that World Series. They didn't.
And Uncle Charlie's still down on the farm
Yes.
to this day.
And he was married to a local girl, and they had 2 sons.
And who was after that?
Anna Lee. And now Anna Lee went to Ohio State, too, where she met her husband. And she lives there yet in Columbus and has 4 children. All their children live there. And I talk to her frequently. Every week I call her. And I've always kept real close touch with Charlie, who I kind of always looked over. I still do. And Anna Lee and I were closer probably than my older ones. And we used to go, even when we were in Brea, Ohio, and with my children, we often went down to Ohio State football games, particularly Ohio State, Michigan, and we are rabid followers of Ohio State.
How many do you think brothers and sisters and nephews and nieces have gone to Ohio State?
Well, remember we had the reunion, and someone said, let's take a picture of Ohio Staters. And now this is a reunion of my brothers, sisters, children, grandchildren, and a few Greeks. And I think it was about 15 people.
This was just last year in 1999.
Well, it was
this year?
97.
1997.
This year. It was 2 years ago before that. And we went, I was amazed. And I have 2 brother-in-laws that went there, so that would make it 16 people.
And then after Uncle Charlie, who was next?
My youngest brother, Bill, the baby, the spoiled one. And he's quite a guy, actually, I think, don't you?
Oh, yeah.
And he went after the war. Well, he started during the war in the V-12 program. He went to Case in Cleveland, and I don't know why they closed it. I think it was. I don't remember whether that was an Army or Navy education program because he was younger. He's 6 years younger than I was, and so they closed it. I asked him why he left the V-12 because he was at Case University in Cleveland, and he says, well, they closed it. So then he decided he was going to go into flying, and I remember he came down to where we were living in Somerville, South Carolina, and he got off of a bus, and he somehow found in this somewhat tropical where we lived, and he hid his luggage and walked to our house and woke us up about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And so we just moved over, the 3 of us, and next day we got over and picked up his luggage. And while he was there, Bill took him out on a ship with him.
This is South Carolina.
South Carolina. And then we bought him a ticket to fly over to Athens, Georgia, And that's the first time he'd been on a ship or a plane. So at that, it was getting near the end of the war, and he was washed out because they were washing everybody out. And then he actually got into, I think it was some kind of security, and he'd been one of the first ones to go into Japan if we'd invaded Japan and hadn't been for the nuclear bomb. He'd been one of the first ones in. I don't know what it was.
Is Charlie going to be in that too?
Oh, yes. After he was injured on Iwo Jima, they sent him back to Hawaii for R&R at that Parker's Ranch in Honolulu. He went back there to visit that a few years ago.
Wasn't that on the Big Island of Hawaii?
Big Island of Hawaii.
Yeah.
Mhm. And he would have gone back. So I think I'm in favor of the nuclear bomb because both of them would have been gone, saved a lot of our lives. And he married East girl from New Haven, Connecticut, and well, before he did that, he went to Ohio State to finish. He got his degree. He started law. He had 2 years actually, and he decided law wasn't for him. He didn't want that. And he went in. He was FBI, and he had some real experiences with that. And then he went in with a pharmaceutical company investigation of fraud and drugs, and he did a lot of investigation over in. I think the Italians had stolen some of our formulas and they sold it back to us, and he was quite well known for that. Did you ever talk to him about that?
Yeah, I did.
And then he married a girl from the East, and they had 4 children, always lived in New Jersey. So it was quite a family. And we stop and think that we all went to this one-room, 8th grade school where my mother went to teach before she was married, and while I was there, I had my mother for a teacher for 3 years. And I thought I could get away with everything, anything or something. And then they used to give you grades in deportment, and she gave me a D in deportment. I've never got over that, but I straightened up fast.
Well, was she the only teacher in the school?
Oh, yeah, you only had one teacher. And you had maybe about 20 kids. Sometimes the 8th graders would help the little 1st graders, and maybe the 1st and 2nd grade would have reading or math together. But the teacher had to do a lot.
What grades were included?
1st through 8th.
Now, how many of the 20 were Fulton kids?
Well, when I was in school, I had Albert and Martha and Charlie and I.
And now, how did you get there?
We walked down the hill. We had a path about a mile down from where we lived up on the hill, which was fine coming down. But you had to walk up that hill at night. And I remember one time my brother Bill later, it was after my mother quit teaching there, and he was going to school there. Because, see, you had 1 through 8th grade, and he was 6 years older than I was. I was 6 years older than he was. And he jumped off of a seat and sprained his foot and couldn't walk. And Anna Lee and I carried him up that whole hill by putting our hands like this. I remember that. I remember that plain.
Wow.
He remembers that.
Well, was Whitby down where the creek is?
Yes.
Now, is that where now there's kind of there's a house with a lot of junk on the outside?
Well, there used to be a bridge. After you crossed the railroad, came through Whitney, there used to be a station where the Baltimore, Ohio train went. And my oldest brothers and sisters went to high school by catching that train going into Blair every day.
How far away was Blair?
We went down the creek, maybe 12 miles. And they stopped at Glencoe, Neffs, Lamara, Neffs, and on into Blair. And they went every day. My brothers would take the milk cans down and put it on the train, and they'd get on the train and go to school and come back on the train. You usually walk back up the hill again.
What do you mean they took the milk cans?
Well, you took your milk down and put it on the train to be sent to the dairy, wherever it was. In those days, that's what we did.
Well, I know that Charlie and Uncle Bill played football, didn't they?
Yes, was the only one that didn't go to Blair High School. I went and stayed with an aunt in Cleveland, in Pittsburgh. And I graduated from high school in Wilkinsburg High School in the Pittsburgh area. But my three younger went to St. Clairesville, and Charlie and William played football there. In fact, my brother Charlie was a guard. He weighed total 140 pounds, and he played against Lou the Toad Groza, who everybody knows. He played for the Cleveland Browns.
And was
And he was a big guy then.
He was an all-star and an all-pro
At Ohio State.
tackle at Ohio State, and then for the Cleveland.
Yeah, well, he went with Paul Brown when he formed the Browns, but he loved it.
Well, how big was St. Clairsville High School?
Oh, at that time, I don't think there were 200 in the class. Probably not, because it was purely residential area.
Well, why did you go to school in Pittsburgh with Aunt
Well,
Anna?
my aunt wanted me to go, and my parents thought I'd get a lot of extra things that the rest of them did. I didn't really, but I did do it the 4 years, which now I don't think it was a good idea, because for a while I was kind of separated from my family, and it was probably easier for me, but I had to live with my aunt, and it was difficult to live with. And maybe I learned a lot about how to get along with someone. Who knows? But it was a good experience. But it was interesting because when I graduated from 8th grade in this one-room school, we had to take an examination, county examination to graduate. And then I went up to Pittsburgh, and I graduated in a class. And I was put in with these kids who were the A students.
Mm-hmm.
There was the AAs from this little one-room school. But I did all right because there were 593 in my class, and I graduated 43rd.
That's good.
So I did very well for my little country one-room school.
Well, the one-room school, Grandma Fulton taught all the different
grades.
courses. Somewhere I had the idea she was a math teacher.
She was good in math. My older brothers and sisters used to do their algebra and geometry, and if they couldn't do it, she could figure it out. She was good in math. In fact, she had wanted to be a doctor, but her father said no. She wanted to be a medical missionary. So she said, I'm going to get married and have 10 children, and she did. But she was excellent in math. You used to be impressed with her math ability.
How about Grandpa Fulton?
Well, he went out to New Concord and stayed with his oldest sister, Laura, and he graduated from Muskingum Academy, and he wanted to be a lawyer. But when he was 17, his father died, and he came over home and took over the farm, and he'd have been a good lawyer.
He was an elected official, wasn't he?
Later, he got in politics. He was county commissioner of the county, Belmont County, for 12 years. And I used to go out, pass out cards for him. All those kids passed out cards with his picture on it and tack them up here and there on all these towns. And the first time I voted for Franklin Delano Roosevelt and my father when I was 21.
Was he, being county commissioner, was that sort of like being the mayor of the county?
Well, they took care of all the roads, construction, the tuberculosis hospital, they used to call it a children's home and a poor folks home, and they were in charge of a lot of things like that. They may have decided where the money went for the county, because we had a surveyor and a sheriff and a I think they took care of the money.
Well,
They had an auditor, but they decided how it was going to be spent.
what was it like growing up on a farm with 9 other brothers and sisters?
Well, it was a self-contained unit. And every Christmas I write a chapter on growing up there, just so my children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren know what it was like. And like, we all had our chores. We come home from school and you gathered the eggs, you brought in the wood, you brought in the coal, you fed the cows, you milked the cows. We all had our jobs. And I can't remember any argument. We did it. And this Christmas I'm writing on how we preserved our food. And we did. We didn't have electricity and refrigeration, and we preserved food by canning. We had a fruit cellar. We had bins maybe 3 or 4 feet by high and about 6 feet deep, 2 of apples, 1 of potatoes. And in that cellar we preserved our eggs. We put, I don't know what the chemical substance, we called it water glass, and you had these big jars, crockery jars, 10-gallon, and you preserved the eggs for cooking in that. And my mother would send us down to get a couple eggs. You had to put your hand in this. It was like very cold, slimy hand lotion to get the eggs. And then we canned food. We'd have maybe 200 or 300 quarts of tomatoes, 100 of peaches. It had to last all winter. And of course, we children had to pick it, prepare it, clean it, prepare it, and help can it.
Well, what were the boys' responsibilities and what were the girls' responsibilities?
Well, they had to in the summertime, they had to take care of the crops. And
The boys?
The boys, yes, the corn and the hay, plant, and they didn't have big machines. They had to just do a lot of it. You had hay shocks, but you'd cut the corn, and you had the old-fashioned hay shocks of corn. It looked so great in the fall. And then that had to dry, and you'd pick the corn off of it. And then the fresh corn, they'd make silage to put in these great big round silver things by the cow barn. And then you'd chew that all up and go up and down in there, and then it would ferment. The cows loved it. You'd put sometimes molasses in it, I think. And you'd put up the hay. And of course, in the wintertime, they had to, do the wheat and bring in all the corn. And in the wintertime, they had to feed all the cattle. They were in a barn, the cows and horses. And shovel it out, too. And take care of feed the sheep. We had 2 sheep houses, and you had to make sure that the sheep had the hay in their barns. It was a lot of work.
Well, when did radio come?
Well, the very first radio we had, I remember it. I was a little girl. It had a battery like about this. I was going to say the size of a car battery, but I'm not sure about that. It had a battery, and it had earphones, and we all had to take turns listening to this earphones. And I remember we had a girl working for us. Her name was Mary Helpinger, and the style then was to bring your hair around these puffs over your ears, and I can remember I was just a little kid, and she had to push these puffs off to put these ear things on to hear, and that's what I remember about our first radio.
When did you get the first radio that you could listen to on a speaker?
Well, we didn't have electricity, and we had a what do you call it? You make your own electricity.
Generator?
Generator. And the family gave my mother this radio for Mother's Day, and she never saw it before it was blown up.
No.
I was in the hospital with strep throat in Pittsburgh, and she was up there. I was in the hospital 6 weeks. It was before antibiotics. And so it was there waiting for her, and the electricity struck the house and blew the whole insides out of it. And we never did get it working again. That was the first big radio. And then, of course, we got electricity in rural electrification. I think it was about 35 or 6 or 7. When Roosevelt started rural electrification.
What about cars?
Well, the first car we ever got was the year I was born. Of course, I don't remember that, but we kept it many years. It was a 1919 Oldsmobile. It was neat. It had, I remember once taking a trip down to my grandmother's, and William was a baby, and it started to rain, and you had these sides you put on to keep the rain out. You had to snap them in, isinglass things. But it had seats that you could pull up, folded toward the back seat, so you could pull those up, and then it would seat more. Well, we filled that up, so then my dad got a Model T. So we'd go to church, both cars, and members of the church said it was just like a calf following their mother cow, with our whole family coming into church in the 2 cars. But we had to put the car up in winter because the roads were so bad. You couldn't drive it in winter, so we still had to get around. Many a time my father would meet us if the snow was too deep in a sled that was, I loved it when he picked us up. Otherwise, we had to go through the drifts up the hill. And it was maybe 4 feet by 7 feet, and about this deep, and we'd be full of straw, and he would pick us up. And that was nice.
Pull it?
2 horses. Yeah. I remember one time when we were it was very early spring, we went to church, and we were on our way home. We had a 2-seated buggy with horses. And we were coming down this road. It's one that comes down past Whitney School. I don't know whether you've been on it or not. And it comes in where the bridge was. And we were coming down there, we hit a rut, and the whole buggy upset. And I still have scissors in my knees from that buggy upsetting.
Who was on it?
Well, Mom and Aunt Lee was, because she remembers it. And probably a lot of us. But Aunt Lee and I remember it. So that was a harrowing experience.
Well, I'm kind of fascinated by the way that you heated your house in the winter. Why don't you explain where you got your fuel?
Well, when I was little, we had fireplaces in every room. And they were used. We used them too. Earlier, before that, and I don't remember, we had our own gas well. And we heated with gas. We had these enamel things. I think it was asbestos. I think it was asbestos. And that was great, apparently. And it would heat one in each fireplace. Well, the well, I guess salt water flooded it, and that was the end of our gas well. But then these fireplaces didn't heat the rooms very well. And like at night, the dining room was a big center, and that's where we'd eat, and we had a big fireplace there, and we burned coal. Also in the cook stove in the kitchen, which heated that area, and then at night we'd study around this dining room table. We always had a big bowl of apples, because we had lots of apples. But I know what you're referring to, where we got our coal. We had our own little coal mine. It went in the side of a hill, and it had sports. We didn't go in deep. I've seen it. I saw it when I was a kid. And we'd haul the coal over, and that's the coal used.
It's kind of an out-of-the-way place. How
Yes.
would they get the coal back?
Horses.
So that was some of what the boys did?
Yes. And in fact, it wasn't in my time, but my father always got, we had a ice house, and he'd bring ice up, cut ice and bring it, and put it in the ice house with the sawdust. But he had the horses that got too hot, and they died, or one of them died, and he wouldn't do it anymore. It was too big a thing for him.
Well, I didn't know you had an ice house.
We did.
Did that supply ice for the summertime?
Well, it was kind of before me. I don't remember that, but it was there. But back of our house, we had a house for coal. We had a wash house where we washed clothes, and we had a smokehouse where we smoked our ham and slabs of bacon. And after we butchered this, we'd hang them there with hickory smoke. We had our own like Virginia hams.
Well, did you have a cooler or ice boxes or?
No, no. In this Christmas letter I'm writing this year, this chapter in this book I'm writing, I'm telling how we preserve food, and there are quite a few methods. One of the methods, beside the canning, we dried. We picked our own hickory nuts and black walnuts, and that were our own nuts. And we froze some vegetables. What we did, we'd dig a hole maybe 3 feet wide and 6 feet long, and I think it was 2 or 3 feet deep. Line it with straw, and put in carrots, tuberous things, carrots, cabbage, parsnips, turnips, and then you cover it with straw and you cover it with the dirt and you froze that. And later in the winter or spring, we dig that up when we needed it. So we froze that.
Now, who tended the gardens?
Oh, we all did. My father would dig them. We had an early spring garden with peas and lettuce and radishes. Then there was a bigger garden, and my dad would plow it and plant it. And we dug the weeds and picked the things. And that's what we children did, you know. We for example, we'd pick berries. We'd go out, pick berries along the fence posts, and maybe we'd get 2 gallon. We'd bring them back, and Mom would make maybe 3 blackberry or black raspberry pies, and she'd make jams and jelly and can some in jars for winter. And I always got poison ivy, and we were always afraid of copperheads and rattlesnakes.
Did anybody ever get bit?
No, but we had a theory, and I don't know if there's anything to it. We always said if you smelled something like cucumbers, it was a copperhead. You know how kids do things and think things. Because most of us got poison ivy. I got the worst in the family. I used to get it all. Finally, they quit having me go because I didn't get it all over me.
Did you look forward to spring and fresh food, or?
Oh, yes. Well, the first day school was out, we went 8 months to school. And you stop and think, 8 months for 7 years, you missed 1 year. We actually went, instead of 8 years, we went 7 years. You figure 7 months for each year. The first day of school, we went barefoot. And we went barefoot all summer.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about farming back in those days. Tell us about, what were the cash crops or cash sources? What did you grow for your own use? What animals did you have?
Okay. Well, I suppose dairy was the biggest crop because you had to feed the animals, the cows. And so a lot of they grew alfalfa and clover and timothy. Timothy was for the horses. And we always had 4 or 6 horses. And we had sheep, and of course they sewed the wool. And every late spring they'd bring the sheep in, and you would shear the wool off the sheep. And they'd roll it up and tie it up and put it up, put it up above we kept our car. And then they had these, when you sold it, they put them in these big sacks, or burlap sacks are about this big and about 10 feet long, and you sell it. You hope that the price of wool was good. Sometimes it was, sometimes it wasn't. Of course, you had to feed the sheep. Of course, they grazed in the summer. You didn't feed them. All the animals grazed in the summertime. The horses had to be fed in summer. But
and the milk you took down to the train station?
yeah, earlier. Later, I think they took it to train a long time. Baltimore and Ohio went through there. At one time, we sold just the cream. We had a separator that we separated the milk from the cream. What did we do with the milk? I know we used to make a lot of cottage cheese, we'd take the we take the sour milk and put it on the stove and to come to a boil, and then the milk, you'd have the cottage cheese and in the whey, the liquid, and then you'd pour it in a paper bag and you'd drain it. And your father said that's the first cottage cheese, or we called it smearcase, it was a German word for it, that he ever liked, and he liked it ever after.
Did you preserve it, or did you have to eat it right
No,
away?
you used it right away, and then you'd get it out of this bag and be a solid, and you'd put pepper, sugar, some milk in it, or whatever you want to put in it. So we made our own cottage cheese.
What about meats? What did you grow? Did you have chickens and hogs, and did you for your own use or consumption, or did you sell them? Or?
Well, when we were young, our two meats were, I'm sure he sold some pigs, but we'd butcher 2 or 3 pigs, and our main meats were chicken and pork. And we had beef. My father would kill beef later after refrigeration, but you had to be able to keep it. Because after he quit dairy, he would grow, or he did that before, he'd buy these little steers. They became steers, and he'd fatten them up and he'd sell them. That was a crop. But I think milk was the biggest thing, and I don't think he sold any hay but it's interesting when you would put ensilage or grind up the corn to put up in the silo, or when you threshed your wheat and got the grain out. It was a neighborhood thing, and all the neighbors would come and help each other. And for a couple of days, you would have maybe 15 men there to eat. It was a big, big thing. And at our house, it's the only time we ever did it, my dad would kill a lamb. We never had it any other time, but these men wanted lamb. And because it was a lot of us hand done, you know. And sometimes when they'd butcher, the neighbor would bring in a hog, because what they'd do, they would gut it, and then they would, I don't know which method, they would put it in, they had these big pots, scalding water, and you'd put it in that and scrape all the hair off, and then then you gutted it. You killed it first, and then you slid it open, and then you did all kinds of things. We made lard, sausage, hams, bacon, all these different processes.
Well, I'll tell you what, why don't you take us through a typical day on the farm in the summer?
In the summertime?
Yeah, starting with the wake-up call. What time did you get up, and what happened then?
Well, my father got up first, and he...
What time?
5 o'clock. And he'd call us about 5:30. He might put on some ham and start a little breakfast, and then he'd call up the back and he'd say, "Time to get up." Everybody got up. And my brothers they ate breakfast first, then they'd go milk cows. And of course we had a lot of work to do, all canning food, and it was lots of work.
Well, what about breakfast?
Well, for breakfast, particularly in the winter, we had, I don't remember having eggs a lot, but we had a lot of pancakes, and my mother would make biscuits in the morning, and she'd often serve it with syrup, and you'd have some bacon or some sausage. But one of our favorites was buckwheat cakes, and she has a starter. A lot of people don't know what buckwheat flour is, but it's gray. It has kind of speckles through it. And she had a starter, and she would fix it the night before and put it by the fireplace, and it would rise and be ready for us in the morning. And that would be served with syrup. And one of the syrups we used was sorghum molasses. We grew our cane for that. And we had a press, and they would have a horse that went around and around, and this press would squeeze out the sorghum molasses. It's a little bit different than sugar. It's a different flavor. And then they'd boil that down, and that was one of our syrups. It's very good for you. It had a lot of iron in it, actually.
Well, then you'd come back for lunch?
Well, then you'd milk the cows, and then you'd go do your work, and then you'd have a full dinner. My mom would make 3 pies, maybe.
This is for lunch now?
Dinner.
For
And
dinner.
then we'd have supper. And you'd have meat and potatoes and vegetables. And you had that all winter because we canned all this stuff. We processed all these foods to use in the wintertime because you couldn't buy it. And you couldn't put it in the refrigerator. And then at night we had a full meal, and maybe she'd make a cake for dessert. So we had a lot of desserts. And of course we had good milk and lots of vegetables. We ate well, even during the Depression when the city people didn't have enough to eat. We ate well even with that many mouths to feed.
Well, without television and movies and radio until later, what did you do for fun, especially at nighttime? And
Well, you went to bed early because we didn't have electricity. We had oil lamps, and we had some gasoline lamps. It was primarily oil lamps. And you got up early. You were ready to go to bed early. And, well, actually, you kind of got up in the summer, you got up at dawn and went to bed just after dark. Because you couldn't read, although education was a big thing. We did a lot of reading. I don't know just how we did it. I have to think about that. Because education was so important to my parents, and they paid extra money for my older ones to go into Blair rather than go to Centerville, the local little school that wasn't too good. So he was a big believer. Both of them were.
well, out of the 10 of you, how many went to college?
8. My brother was killed, and my brother Charlie didn't. But the rest of them did. Did very well.
Well, just to kind of do the last of this session, which I hope will be the first of several sessions, tell me about when you and Dad got married, about the wedding itself, and I'd also like to hear about the first time that you took Dad to the farm in southern Ohio, and the first time you went to the farm in LaGrange.
Well, I went to LaGrange. Let's see. No, Bill came down to my house first because I met him the last 2 weeks of my junior year, and he came down to see me. I was surprised, and I didn't give him directions. Particularly, I knew he was coming, and it's hard to find where we live. You know that.
Yeah.
Well, he was in St. Clairesville, and he ran into Frank Hanlon was a fraternity brother his at Ohio State, ATL, and he gave him directions how to get to my house. Well, he got way over on another ridge, way over here. That's Margaret and Kit and Catherine Fulton, Walker Fulton's family. Well, they sent him over. He got to Uncle George's house, which was on the same ridge, but it was the wrong Fulton. Finally, he got to our house. It was a real shock for him because it was very hilly, and he grew up very, very level. But he liked it. He loved to go down to that house. And of course, my youngest brother was about 6th grade or 5th, and he thought Bill came to see him, and so he entertained him all the time and told jokes. I won't tell you these jokes because some of them are pretty. Bill thought they were funny. He thought they were funny. But he loved to go down there.
Yeah. How about the first time you went to LaGrange?
Well, I went up to LaGrange the first time when I was senior in college. Went up for a weekend. I was going to say I went up for his alumni, but it was earlier because it was in the fall. And I remember there was a cider barrel out in back of the garage, and Phil's father enjoyed it. And I went up for alumni in May, and he was still drinking out that cider barrel back in the back of the barn or somewhere. But Bill had 2 sisters, and his mom taught school, and his father farmed. He'd been an engineer on the New York Central, and Grandma inherited these 90 acres. And she didn't want to come back to the farm, but Gramp did. He left the New York Central, and they came there and built their house. And that's where they raised their family, in LaGrange, Ohio, which is near Elyria, west of Cleveland. And you used to go out there a lot of times.
Yeah.
We used to go down to the farm a lot.
You know, looking at a lot of the old pictures of the Wiggard family, even when Grandpa Henry was a kid, I would see them nipping on the bottle. But so that must have been a different attitude at the Wiggard family compared with the Fulton
Oh,
family.
yes. My mother belonged to the WTCU, Women's Christian Temperance Union. She was very opposed, and we didn't have alcohol at all. Bill's mom wasn't too much for it, but Grandpa kind of enjoyed it a little bit.
Now, how strict was that policy about alcohol in the Fulton family? I mean,
We just never had it, ever. In fact, the younger ones weren't allowed to play cards or anything, but my father didn't care. He said he never was allowed to, but he relaxed. He relaxed on things that we were strict covenantal Presbyterians, and straight from Scotch Irish from Ireland, actually. And they're very strict, very, very strict.
well,
We didn't have the opportunity. The thing we have to remember, we provided all our own entertainment. We children, our imaginations carried us through, because we didn't have neighbors to play with. And never in our life did we ever say we're bored. We just went out, and our imagination carried us away.
Well, was there some event like the county fair or Labor Day or July 4th or something like that where you would, when you were a kid, where you would get to, or church maybe, where you'd get to meet a lot of people?
Not when we were little, and July the 4th was a bad day to remember, because that's when they started cutting the wheat. And they had this binder, and this binder would break. And Bill's father was the same way, I found out. And my father would get so excited and swear around a little bit, and it was just so frustrating. He had to get this wheat done, and something would break in this old binder. It was for the combine. This binder that had this canvas that would carry the grain over, and then it would be in. Then you had to tie it in sheaths like this, and then you made little shocks. You'd put maybe 4, and then you'd spread over, and then later you had to go and pick that wheat up and take it out to be threshed to get the grain out of it. And you had this traveling threshing machine would come in and thresh the grain and blow out the straw in a stack for the barn. But just you had to plant this wheat. You had, I don't know whether you had to dig weeds or not, and then you had to cut it, and then you had to furrow it into long furrow lines, and then you had to take that and tie it in these shocks about this big with binder's tape, the binder's cord. And then you'd take about 4 of these, make a shock, and it would be about this high, and you'd take one and spread over it, and then that had to dry. And when that was dry, they'd carry it by horse and wagon into the barn, and the threshing machine would come from farm to farm. And you'd thresh and get all the grain out, fill the granary.
And then what did the combine do? How did it
Later,
change
the combine would do the whole process.
So when was that introduced?
Oh, I was older. I don't remember what.
I mean, had you left home by that time?
I was pretty grown up.
Well, getting back to this, did you go to the county fair each year?
Yes, we went. It was about the first week of school, and each one of us was given 50 cents. Everything was 5 cents a ride. So figure out how many rides, 50 and 50 cents. That was a lot of rides.
Well, was that one of the big events of the year?
Yes.
Was it the biggest outside of the farm?
And that in church. And later we got involved in rural extension, but that was when we were older. And they had fairs, But that was a big thing, the fair. And I remember one time, we'd take a big picnic, and we'd take our Oldsmobile 1919, and we'd have baskets of picnic, and we'd spread it out. And one time Anna Lee got lost. She was just, I remember she was just a little kid. And they were trying to find out what her father's name, and she was bawling her eyes out, and she said her father's name was Papa. And we found her, and she couldn't give them any information. I'll have to remind her of that. She wouldn't remember, she was too little. And so we'd ride the merry-go-round. They didn't have as much stuff now as they have, but of course you looked at all the animals, and you looked at all the displays with 4-H. And later we became involved in 4-H in the agriculture extension. And in fact, you may not know this, but when I was in 4-H, I made a design and made a suit. It was a light blue wool, and it was tweedy on the top and plain on the bottom. And I won the best in Belmont County, and I went to the state fair. And you had to model at the state fair. And I didn't win there, but the girl that did win that year went to Ohio State, and I met her later. Her name was Beth Sarin. And she won. I remember when she won it. But you didn't know that, did you?
No, I didn't. Well, I'll tell you, for the kind, since it's Thanksgiving has just ended, and we're now looking towards Christmas, why don't you, for our last topic this evening, describe Christmases on the farm?
Well, it was a pretty big event. The Christmas tree was decorated in the big living room.
Where'd you get the Christmas tree?
I think it was cut somewhere.
On the farm?
Yeah, it must have been. You know, pine type. And although I don't remember pine trees, but I'm sure they didn't buy it. And it was put up Christmas Eve.
How'd you decorate it?
We didn't do it. Santa Claus did it.
Oh.
And, you know, you had the garland. We had these real old, I don't know what happened to our Christmas tree decorations. I never got them. But one thing I remember about our Christmas tree, under the tree there was this bowl with water in it, and we had swans and ducks. That's what I'd like to have. Nobody knows what happened to it. And geese floating around it, and you'd have farm animals. They were sort of plastic or celluloid standing around. That's one thing I remember about it. Actually, we had pretty good Christmases because Anna, my Aunt Anna, and Uncle Charlie's wife, Aunt Elsie would shop after Christmas, and she'd buy these toys for us. We had pretty good toys considering we didn't have much. I still have the dishes that she gave me. I'll show them to you when you come, and they came from, they were Japanese. That's before Japanese things were thought too much about, and they're so sheer you can see through them. And of the 6, I had a pink set, and my sister Ann had the pink. Only one thing ever got broken. My brother Bill broke it 2 days after Christmas. And every time my granddaughters come, I would hover over them and let them drink out of these. I'll show them to you when you come down. And that's one of my prized possessions. But we got dolls, and we didn't get a lot. Or 1 or 2 things. We were happy.
Did you wake up in the morning and?
Yeah, we had to get up in the morning. But the chores had to be done, and we weren't allowed to go down the front steps. We had to go down the one that came from the into the back stairs into the dining room. And the milking had to be done, and the turkey had to be in, and we used to look through keyholes to see if we could see in there and see that tree. I have some pictures of our tree, and. It was a big day, but we didn't actually get in there until about 10 because the turkey and the milk cows had to be taken care of and all that, you know. And then we have a noon, kind of late noon meal with a big turkey. In fact, my mother raised turkeys.
Oh, really?
For sale, yeah.
Huh.
It was one of her money crops.
Was there any socializing outside of the family on Christmas?
No, just us.
And what about New Year? Was there anything special about New Year?
Well, you know, one thing I can remember we had always on New Year's, Mom would get these oysters, would get cans cooled, and she always had the oyster stews I can remember that.
Hmm.
That was and I don't know where she got the oysters, because they had to be chilled, and you bought them in a can you could see through it. I remember that.
Great.
But our Christmas was pretty good. I have to. We got all the little things, you know. We always had oranges under there, which was a treat. We didn't get oranges often.
You didn't grow those on the farm?
No. But we had apples, and we picked our own nuts. Hickory nuts was picking the hickory nuts. That was a treat because they were clean. But we got black walnuts. And when they got them off the ground, and they were kind of greenish brown, and we put them on the roof of the chicken house to dry out, and then they dried, and this casing became a ugly olive green, and we had to pick that off, and our hands were this color. And then you had to put the black walnuts to dry, and then after they were dried, you could bring them in the house.
Good.
And then used for all kinds of cooking, desserts mainly, candy.
All right, well, why don't we stop here and do this some more some other time?
Okay, just keep this one.